We started the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Gimel Amid Beis. And the Mishnah is speaking about three categories of individuals who are not obligated in Shekalim, but yet, if they offer the Shekalim on a voluntary basis, we can accept them. And there's a big chiddush here. So take, for example, one of these three categories is Nashim. And women are exempt from the mitzvah of Masechet Shekalim for one of two reasons. Either because it's Zman Grama, which we found very strange, or because of a pasuk that says Ish. Now the woman comes forward, and on her own volition, she wants to offer a contribution of a Masechet Shekalim. This is problematic because since she's not obligated, she's not giving it as part of the tzibur, she's giving it as a yachid. It's what's called a nidvas yachid. And with regard to a yachid, we have a problem because the money in the Trumas Halishka that was collected for the Masechet Shekel is earmarked for Karbonos Tzibur. And if her monies are her own individual monies, then she can have a nidavas yachid, but it's not part of the tzibur. So therefore, we have to guarantee that when she offers voluntarily this Masechet Shekel, she has a das limsar litzibur yafa yafa. That's the language that appears over and over again in the Mefarshim, which means that she's not interested in her own personal partnership or ownership in the karbonos that will be bought and purchased from these monies, but rather she wants to donate these monies to the entire tzibur and be part and parcel of the enterprise of the tzibur offering the Masechet Shekel, which was going to be, as we said, collected and earmarked for the karbonos tzibur. So that's what we have to be careful about, and we're going to make sure that the women will give it for that purpose. As a general rule, we can assume that someone who is voluntarily offering a Masechet Shekel wants to do it the right way and be part of the tzibur. But nevertheless, we have to be very careful and guarantee that that's going to be so. What I'd like to discuss with you for a few minutes, and I touched on it last week, is Rabbi Kiveger, as you know, wrote comment on the Mishnah. And in his comment on this Mishnah, he discusses the status of Nashim with regard to Tfilas Musaf. Now, a woman could be part of all the karbanos. And even if we assume that Tfilos Keneged Karbanos Tiknum, nevertheless, she can participate in those tfilos just like she can participate in those karbonos. Musaf, however, he says, has a special category. And I'll read to you just one line from Rabbi Kiveger. He writes that Isa b'tshuvas b'samim rosh. Now, some scholars had attributed this tshuva sefer to the Rosh, but it's not so. And other scholars say that we shouldn't even be quoting this sefer. So this becomes an ongoing pulmus, a historical controversy about the status of this sefer called Shuvos B'Samim Rosh, whether it's acceptable, reliable, or not reliable. Again, this is a major, major issue with opinions to each extreme. I mean, there's some sofer was so opposed to the sefer, he wouldn't allow you to go near it. But in any event, Rabbi Kiveger does quote the Psamim Rosh. Nashim pturos mitfilas musaf. In other words, even though the Gemara establishes in the Masechet Brachos on Daf Chav that women are obligated in tefillah, and the reason for that is tefillah rachmeninu. The essence of tefillah is bakashas rachamim, and women, no less than men, need bakashas rachamim. We're all dependent upon the Almighty. However, as the Psamim Rosh points out, Musaf is radically different than all other tefillos. All other tefillos essentially are bakashas rachamim. And that's what tefillah is all about. But not so in the case of Musaf. In Musaf, we're talking about a carbon. Again, it's hard to formulate this in words because it defies rational understanding, but somehow the tefillas musaf itself is a replacement for the carbon musaf. And the carbon musaf, of course, is a carbon tzibur. Now, if women are exempt from shkalim, that means that they have no obligation whatsoever to participate in that collection of funds that is earmarked for karbanos tzibur. So therefore, they should be exempt from tefillas musaf, which is an exact replacement of carbon musaf. And he writes, Isha shelo haisa shokeles, that she had no obligation to offer the machzah shekel, according to the Torah law, they're not obligated because they don't have a part in the karbanos tzibur. Therefore, there is no obligation upon a woman to daven tefillas musaf. You could say all other tefillos that are essentially bakashas rachamim is a woman needs rachamim just like a man. But when the tefillah is to replace a carbon tzibur, and women are exempt from a carbon tzibur, that's why they don't participate in the shkalim. Therefore, they're exempt from tefillas musaf. However, Rabbi Kivega points out, shekvar nagu hanoshim lispalel kol davar. Kol davar means even tefillas musaf. Again, you could ask I don't know. I'm not sure that every woman has accepted upon herself to daven tefillas musaf, but apparently there are noshim sinkanios that voluntarily daven tefillas musaf. The chivu es atzma, and they accept it upon themselves as if they're obligated, like all the other mitzvahs. And in the context of our Mishnah Shekalim, it fits like a glove because the Mishnah says that the women would bring forward their Shekalim on a voluntary basis and we would accept them. They wanted to be part of a carbon tzibur. And they can do so on a voluntary basis by giving their monies to the tzibur, and that's the Shekalim. Now, the Shuva here, this commentary here of Rabbi Kivega, he adds a tzlach, the Nodam Yehuda, who was not long before Rabbi Kivega. And he says that the tzlach had a whole different explanation, coming to the same conclusion that women are exempt from tefillas musaf based on the principle of mitzvah aseh shazman grama. Now again, we can always ask, if you're identifying tefillah as a mitzvah seishas grama, maybe women should be exempt from all tefillos, shachris, mincha, ma'ariv. But the answer is that on a doraisa level, mitzvah asil is pal pam achas biyom. So on a doraisa level, it's not a mitzvah seishas grama, and you can be mekayim this mitzvah tefillah anytime. Hence, women are included in the chiyuv tefillah. It's not as man grama. But when we get to musaf, musaf is clearly zman grama. There's no other day of the week that we recite musaf except for Shabbos or Yom Tov. And therefore, the Nodam Yehuda came to the conclusion that women are exempt from tefillas musaf. We have now two different approaches to the same halachic principle, namely that women are exempt from tefillas musaf. One approach is Rabbi Kivega based on the Bisam and Rosh, that they are not part of Shekalim, they're not obligated in Shekalim. And the other approach is the Nodam Yehuda, who says that women are exempt from musaf because it's a mitzvah aseh shazman grum. But here we have a problem with a principle that is formulated by the Magen Avram. Magen Avram says that women can accept upon themselves an obligation vis-a-vis man grama on a voluntary basis, unless, and here's the following exception to the rule, the mitzvah itself is a bracha. If the mitzvah is a bracha, then when it comes to brachos, you're either obligated or you're not obligated. But there's no such thing as voluntarily deciding to to recite a bracha. Now, if you are familiar with people who make brachos in situations where it seems that they're not obligated, then you're going to have to say that those brachos are generated by a certain emotional state of being and become very subjective. But those are very few and far between. Those are rare exceptions to the rule. Could be Tfilas HaDerech might fit into that category. Could be Shechiyanu as a bracha would fit into that category. Maybe even the bracha on Hal on Rosh Chodesh could fit into that. There are some exceptions to the rule. But the general rule is when it comes to mitzvahs, there's no, half pregnancy. Either you're chayiv in the bracha or you're not chayiv in the bracha. And if women are not chayiv because the mitzvah is man grama, then the Magen Avraham says there's no option for a woman to take upon herself a chiyuv bracha. Halacha doesn't recognize a self-imposed voluntary chiyuv bracha. And therefore, eich noshim ispalos tfilas musa. We don't understand, and again, this doesn't depend upon Rabbi Akiva Eiger with the tshuva the Psalm Rosh or the Nod Yehuda. Either way, women are exempt from musa. And the Magen Avraham is going to be hard pressed to justify that women, on their own voluntary basis, will recite tfilas musa. Now, let's ask a general question and see if we can come back to this Magen Avraham. The Gemara establishes that tfilos keneged tmidim tiknum. Now, what does that mean? Tmidim are korbanos tzibur. If you're going with Rabbi Akiva Eiger's approach to the Psalm Rosh, then women should be exempt from tefillah. Why? Because there's no connection between tefillah as a substitute for karbanos, in the case of tmidim, which are karbanos tzibur, and mashet. They're not included in shkolim. And the Gemara in Brachos says, on the Mishnah, in Daf Chaf and Aleph, the Mishnah says, Noshim chayovas b'tefillah, and the Gemara in Daf Chaf and Beis asks, Pshita, tefillah rachmeininu. Kasha. Im lemandi omer tefillah keneged tmidim tiknum. Is then, why does the Gemara think it's Pshita? And here, Rabbi said, we have to differentiate between tefillah d'oraisa and tefillah d'rabbanan. Tefillah d'oraisa is once a day, any time of the day, even when we wouldn't bring a carbon tum. If a person would daven ma'ariv and there's no carbon tum in ma'ariv time, he would still fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa of tefillah. Tefillah is one time a day, and that's the Rambam is outspoken about that. D'oraisa, all you need is one time. The Rabbanan, when Masechet 3 tefillahs a day. When the Gemara has the kasha pshita, tefillah rachmeininu, the Gemara is referring to tefillah d'oraisa once a day. When you talk about women vis-a-vis the 3 tefillos a day, and each tefillah is connected to a carbon, let's say shachar is to Tomin Shel Shachar, and mincha to Tomin Shel Bein Arbayim, you have a real issue. A, according to the Rav Akiva Eiger Psalm Rosh, because women are not part of tefillah of a carbon tzibur, and B, according to the Nod Yehuda, because women are exempt because of Zman Groma. So we're going to have to say the following, that with regard to tefillos in general, on a D'Rabbanan level, let's talk about Shachris and Mincha. Ma'ariv is a little bit more complicated, but Shachris and Mincha. When we say tefillos keneged tmidim tiknum, we don't mean that the essence of the tefillah is a replacement for the carbon tummy. There is an obvious correlation, and the tefillos that the Rabbanan instituted, Shachris and Mincha, correspond to the tefillah, but the tefillah is meaningful per se, has its own independent kiyum, and it's related and connected. So why did the Rabbanan make a tefillah in Shachris time, another tefillah in Mincha time? That's because of the Tamid Shel Shachar, Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, but they are separate, independent takanos. Not so Musaf. Musaf is a tefillah that replaces the carbon. It's not connected carbon Musaf tiknu, but this is, by its very essence, tefillas, or shall I say, carbon Musaf. There's an exact equation between tefillas Musaf and carbon Musaf, and therefore women would be exempt from it. Imkein noshim pturos mi Musaf. And then kasha, how do we reconcile this with the Magen Avraham? Eich noshim ispal. We don't understand how women could daven tefillas musaf on a voluntary basis. Now, the truth is that even without the Magen Avraham, I have to tell you, Abosai, tefillas musaf is, for women, is again, Lefianis Daiti is a problem. I'm not coming here to pasuk. I'm just saying on a conceptual basis. Why? Because at best, you could say that tefillas musaf for Nashim is a tefillas nedava. But there's no tefillas nedava, neither on Shabbos nor on Yom Tov. Because a carbon nedava is not brought neither on Shabbos nor on Yom Tov. So how could women voluntarily opt for a tefillas musaf on Shabbos or Yom Tov as a tefillas nedava? There is no such thing as a tefillas nedava on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So today, for example, right now, I could decide I'm going to get up and offer a tefillah on a voluntary basis, somewhere between Shachris and Mincha. That I can do. But on Shabbos, I can't do such. So once we assume, whether it's this way or that way, whatever the reasoning is, that women are exempt from tefillas musaf, how can they daven tefillas musaf on Shabbos and Yom Tov as an nedava? So forget about the Magen Avraham. Again, the Magen Avraham is giving us another reason to object and to be concerned about this, but irrelevant to the Magen Avraham. We have to somehow reconcile tefillas musaf of Nashim with the principle that there's no carbon nedava and no tefillas nedava on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And all this is tzarech iyun. The Achronim, they don't understand how this works. The one who tries to take a shot out of it is one of the later Achronim, a tshuva called Pischa Zuta. He wants to suggest that there's a halacha called Unishalma Parim Tzvasenu, and he wants to say that after because Musaf has a tefillah as a replacement for the Karban Pesach, therefore it's not like a bracha. Normally, the Magen Avraham would say that in the case of a bracha, there's no such thing as an optional voluntary bracha. Ain't no such institution. But in a case where the bracha itself is a replacement for a carbon, then we're not dealing with a mitzvah that's essentially a bracha, but rather a mitzvah that's a maisa. It's an action. It's a bringing of a carbon. And women, or anyone who's parted from a mitzvah that has a maisa to it, can voluntarily. So that bracha now can be classified under two categories. It's either a bracha or it's a maisa. And we would never have suggested that a bracha is a maisa. But that's what he wants to suggest to justify women davening musaf in the light of this Magen Avraham. Now, he quotes here a Bar Tanura. The Bar Tanura says if you recall, we quoted it last week, that although a young boy, a young man, I should call him, is exempt from shkalim until the age of 20, but nevertheless, he can offer on a voluntary basis his machzis hashek. But now we have to understand the law of yotzamotzi. What do I mean? Imagine that a young boy, he's bar mitzvah, he's not yet 20, that's 7 years of his life. He wants to daven, and we want to appoint him as the shliach tzibur. And the shliach tzibur is going to recite chazaras hashatz. No one would blink about that. No one would have any hesitation. But now we have a problem, says the Torah T'mima. Lo yuchal katan zel liot shliach tzibur b'tfilas musa. Could you imagine that a rabbi in a community is going to give a bang on the extended? He's going to say the earliest age, the youngest age for a shliach tzibur for musaf has got to be 20 years old. And why is that? Because yotza motzi only applies when both share the same chiyuv, and that's called arvus. But in this case, since he's less than 20 years old, he doesn't have a chiyuv shkalim, and therefore the korban musaf and the tefillas musaf that replaces it is purely voluntary. And someone who volunteers for a mitzvah, with all due respect, cannot be motzi someone who's obligated to the mitzvah because they don't share the same chiyuv. And the Torah T'mima is saying something that's very, very logical. It's very compelling. But again, if I would come in and say such a thing in shul, they would laugh at me. That he can't be a shliach tzibur, and especially nowadays, I don't know if it was always like this. Probably it was. We try to encourage the young people to play a role in the shul. This is how we bring them in. They get a special excitement about being a shliach tzibur, but the Torah T'mima is saying that it doesn't make any sense in the case of Musa. Very fascinating. Now, I just want to end this discussion about Tfilas Musaf with a tshuva the Ber Yitzchak. If I'm not mistaken, now I don't want to say this, but I think it was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. In any event, he says the following: that if you're going to tell me that he who is potter from shkalim is ipso facto potter from Tfilas Musaf, and that's Rabbi Kivega's line of reasoning, what are we going to say about Kohanim and Leviim with regard to Tfilas Musaf? According to Ben Bukhari, he says that Kohanim are potter from shkalim, and by the same token, Leviim are potter from shkalim. We mentioned this in the name of the Shara Melech, if you recall. And the reason for this is because the Torah says that only those who are counted directly, well, that's not a good word, only those who passed on the line, one by one, passing Moshe Rabbeinu, who were counted, kol overall apkudim, they are included in Masechet Shekalim. They need a kofar nefesh. The Leviim were not counted in the same way at all. They weren't overall apkudim. And Ben Bukhari says, therefore, the Leviim were potter. Again, Ben Bukhari himself is focused on the Kohen, but the same logic applies to the Leviim. The Leviim were not included in the original counting. Moshe Rabbeinu passed by the Ohel, and he got a baskol to tell him who was in the Ohel, how many members of the family, etc. So if those who were not counted directly by passing on the line are not chayiv and shkolim, then the Shara Melech points out that Leviim are not chayiv and shkolim. If that be the case, then a Levi, and for sure a Kohen, no matter what age he is. In the case of a young man from Shar Shiftei Yisrael, we're going to say, well, he's less than 20. He's not chayav, and he can't be motzi others. He can't be the shots from Musa. But now we're saying the entire Shevet Levi is excluded according to Ben Bukhri. Did Ben Bukhri imagine that Leviim are not chayav in Tfilas Musa? And he says they should be potter. He says that he's less upset about the case of a katan in inverted commas, meaning he's less than 20, because here we could say, you know what? Now he's not chayiv, but sofo lios bichlal achiv. But in the case of Leviim, according to Ben Bukhri, you can't even say such a thing. He'll never be chayiv. And based on this logic, the Ber Yitzchak comes up with a radical conclusion. And he says, Ein muchach she'ein chiyuv shkolim tolui b'chiyuv havas shkolim. That there are two dinim. There's havas hashkolim, which means the implementation, the actualization of a chiyuv, and then there's the abstract chiyuv. So if you want to know if somebody's a bar chiyuva, the answer is he was part of a Kriyas Yamsuf and he's a bar chiyuva. You ask him whether he brings the shkolim, then we have to know where and how he was counted at the time of overall apkudin. So if you have someone who's less than 20, or a Kohen or a Levi, he's certainly a bar chiyuva in shkolim, even though he's not included in havas hashkolim. For example, we can't be mamashkin him. We can't take away his kitchen table, in lieu of the shkolim that he hasn't produced. But as far as his ability to participate in, let's call it tfilas musav, and even to play a role to be motzi others in tfilas, he's chayav. He's a bar chiyuva. He's a bar chiyuva in shkolim. He's a bar chiyuva in tfilas musav as well. The separate din in hava. Pretty radical condition. Now, our Mishnah says, let's just review, that if a woman comes forward, or for that matter, a katan, let's say he's between the ages of 13 and 20, we'll get to the younger age in just a second, and he offers, or she offers her shkolim on a voluntary basis, then we accept it. Now that means that she, or let's go to the young man who's less than 20, will have a chelek in the carbon tzibur. So you might say that whether or not you're included in tfilas musav, and we said that according to Magen Avraham, there's no such thing as a voluntary tefillah or bracha. It depends upon whether or not we accept your shkolim, not on whether you're obligated to bring forward the shkolim. But if we accept your shkolim, then that indicates that you're part of the carbon tzibur. And if this tefillah is to replace the carbon tzibur, you, no less than anyone else, are part of that tefillah, because that tefillah is, in a general sense, part of a carbon which you will and or can participate in. So the tefillas musaf was established for anyone who has a kiyum of shkolim, not a chiyuv of shkolim, but whose shkolim we can accept, as long as you can incorporate yourself and integrate yourself with your voluntary gift of a shekel into the shkolim of the tzibur, then you're obligated in tefillas musaf. Tefillas musaf was established to replace the carbon that you could be part of. A guy, for example, as we're going to learn in the next line in the Mishnah, or a kusi, who comes forward on a voluntary basis to offer their shkolim, they want to be part of our carbon tzibur, they can't. We won't accept their machzah shekel, their mufka. excluded from Masechet Shekel. We cannot accept their Masechet Shekel. Hence, they're not part of the Korban Tzibur. But in the cases of Noshim and Ktanim, they could become part of the Korban Tzibur if they offer that Masechet Shekel on a voluntary basis, and we will accept. But here we have a major problem. This is the very famous Ktsos HaChosh. When our Mishnah says Katan, it refers not to a bar mitzvah who has saros, but even to a Katan. Let's say he's a Ben Tes. It's considered that he has a certain element of Das, and he wants to participate in the Shkolim. And we mentioned that if the father gives it on his behalf, he's really picking up the fee of the child. Very fascinating proposition that kapara is something that includes a wide range of members of Klal Yisrael. Now, how does this work? What is the modus operandi? We say that by voluntarily bringing a shekel, you are now part of the Korban Tzibur. You are giving your shkolim to the Tzibur so that now we can take those shkolim, even those that were offered voluntarily, and purchase a Korban Tzibur. Says the Ktsos, but how is a Katan able to be makna the shkolim? If the whole preposition, the whole enterprise of a voluntary shekel offering, a contribution that will be accepted on a voluntary basis, is because of a kinyan in which the person who volunteers gives over his shekels to the tzibur, and it's no longer his own shkolim, then we have to presume that that individual has the capability to be makna a shekel. That's not true in the case of a katan. Says the Ktsos, B'Rabbanon, he could be makna his shekel. And here the Ktsos comes to a radical conclusion that a kinyan d'Rabbanan is moil midoraisa, that even on a doraisa level, as far as the carbon is concerned, the carbon is defined as a carbon tzibur based on the hakna of a katan, which is only d'Rabbanan. And in Hilchas Kiddushin, for example, this has tremendous ramifications, because it means that if a person, let's say, is kohen an object with dalet amos, which is only a kinyan d'Rabbanan, it can be mekadosh an isha. It should be a full-fledged isha d'oraisa with a chiyuv misa, or with a requirement of a get, and so forth and so on. The Kiddushin is recognized in Torah, even though the kinyan itself is only d'Rabbanan. And the Nesivis is not so excited about this. He has a different take here. He thinks this whole enterprise of receiving a gift from a katan is all based on hefker, bezdin, hefker, which is a doraisa halacha that empowers the bezdin to take money and transfer it to someone else. Well, maybe we're not sure. You remember we had a discussion where the hefker bezdin hasn't go as far as bezdin can take money out of Ruvain's pocket and put it into Shimon's pocket. But in any event, one thing is clear, that bezdin says the Nesivis could take the gift of the katan and make it into hefker. Once they make it into a hefker, and the tzibur could be koner that shekel, and that's the way it operates. Okay. Hanochri ve'akusi sheshaklu ein mekablim. We do not accept a voluntary offer, a contribution of a machzah shekel from a kusi or a nochri. And the Rash Soroleo says this is all based on a pasuk in Vayikra Chav Beis, Umiyad b'neichar lo sakrivu es lechem Elohechem mikol elaki mashchasam b'hem mumbam lo yeratzu lachem. We don't accept a carbon from a ben neichar. Ben neichar in this context means a goy. Okay, so we have a very interesting comment here. So, 1 second. based on the Ramban. The Ramban says in his critique on the Rambam, Sefer Mitzvahs, that if we accept a matzahs hashekel from a guy, ovrim alotas, this is a violation of a lav d'oraisa, because the Torah says umiyad ben nechar lo sakrivu, etc. So since lechem alakechem is a reference to the carbon tumid, and by accepting the matzah shekel, says the Ramban, we are accepting a carbon tumid, meaning a carbon tzibur of a guy, then we're violating the law of miyad ben nechar lo sakrivu. Then he goes one step further. And he says that if we accepted the shekel of the guy, hakarbon nifsa, the carbon itself becomes possible. Again, he's not operating with bittul barov that we mentioned the name of Rashi. So they took his shekel from John Paul Jones, and they bought into a carbon tzibur, a carbon tumid. The carbon is possible, says the Ramban. So the Mechaschina says that he thinks Rashi would disagree because based on the halacha of bittul. Okay, that we figured that out on our own. Now, if you know, I have it here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. Rav Perlo wrote a super commentary on Sefer Mitzvahs of Rav Sajagon, and in his commentary, it's massive. The man has Kol HaTorah at his fingertips. He defends the Rambam very often against the critique of the Ramban in Sefer Mitzvahs. He writes, "B'ledas Ramban, a pasuk medaber kishalom masor yafal etzibur." However, im masor yafal etzibur mekabla mehen. This is wild. The Ramban, the way that Re Perlo is interpreting the Ramban, would hold that if the guy gave his money to the tzibur as machzas hashekel, then we would accept his money. In basar letzibur yafa yafa. I mean, I don't understand how he's learning the Mishnah. I mean, the Mishnah says, "Hanachi rakusi sheshaklu ein mekabel mehen." And we're talking about a contrast that the Mishnah is establishing between nashim, who are not chayav in shkolim, and a guy. An isha is patur, but she's included in the parsha of the karbanos, and she can be moser her shkolim yafa yafa to the tzibur. And on that gufa, the Mishnah says, but ein mekablin min hanachri umin akusin. So you're going to have to say that according to the understanding of the Re Perlo, the Ramban is going to say that the Mishnah means in general, we don't assume that the guy, like the Isha, would give his shkolim with such a magnanimous way of yafa letzibur letzibur. An Isha would, but not a guy. But Lui Yitzur, if we know that the guy makes a declaration, I want to give this money over to the tzibur, yafa yafa, then we could take this gift even from a guy. Pretty way out. And he wants to suggest that maybe b'derabbanan we shouldn't accept it from a guy because we don't trust him. They don't have ne'manos, and therefore we shouldn't accept it. But that's already a takanas chachamim. That's not a doraisa. in the light of this chiddush of the reperlau, we could begin to suggest, I don't see it written out here, but it makes sense that maybe that's why the Rambam doesn't count this as a lav, because it really depends upon whether the Nachri is Moser Yafa Yafa. There's no absolute lav here that says we cannot, under all circumstances or any circumstances, accept the voluntary gift of a guy for Masechet Shekalim. Now, at this point, the Mishnah sort of branches out to other karbanos. Which karbanos can a Nachri offer in the Beis HaMikdash, and which can he not? And basically, the rule is that a karban chova does not apply to a guy. He's completely excluded from a karban chova. And the Mishnah will now give us a whole list. But a karban nedava, for example, an ola, which can be brought on a voluntary basis, or a shlamim. Again, shlamim is going to be a big machlokas, but in theory, shlamim, which can be brought on a voluntary basis as a nedava, can be brought by a guy. A guy is included in karbanis nedav, not in karbanis chol. So ein makabel biyadam kinei zavim v'kinei zavos v'kinei yoldos. Now, I would suggest, and I think I can prove it to you from the Mefarshim here, that this particular part of the Mishnah is focused on kusim, not on nachri, because the entire enterprise of tumas ziva, tumas yoledes, that they have to bring a kan tzipor as part of their tara from tuma, that doesn't apply to a guy. So I don't need the Mishnah to tell me that we're not going to accept the karbonos of tara when these categories of tuma are totally inapplicable. But kusi, according to one man Diomar, they were gerei emes. They really accepted Judaism. Right, the whole story about the king of Assyria after he exiled 10 out of 12 shvatim, and the land was desolate, so he imported the kusim from what's the name of that area? It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, it was near Aram Naharaim where Avram Avinu came from. So anyway, there's a whole area, and he brought in these kusim, and the kusim claimed that they wanted to become Jewish. And the whole issue is whether they really did want to become Jewish, or it was just that they were afraid of the punishments that they would suffer if they didn't become Jewish. So now the question is, what about these categories of Tuma, like Yoledes and Zava, with regard to Kus? So with regard to Kusim, the minhag that was established by Chazal is we're not going to consider that dini tuma. We're going to exclude them from all dini tuma. Therefore, karbanos, which are brought as part of the process of tara, we will not accept them. And all this is because Chazal saw that the Kusim, whether it could be at one point in history they did accept Judaism, but certainly during the flow of time, they were worshipped Avodah Zarah. And if I remember correctly, Lord Chulin talks about how they worshipped the mountains and this, that, and the other thing. And Chachamim wanted to be marchik us and keep us away from intermarriage with the Kusim. And we find similar xeros at the end of Masechet Avodah Zarah with regard to Yayin, Shel Nachrim, etc. Chasnus, Mishum Chasnus. So we don't treat the Kusim like we would a full-fledged Jew. And this will avoid any intermarriage with the Kusim. Now the Mishnah goes on to say, and this next part I think would address even Nachrim, that we don't accept chatos v'ashamos. Because again, a chatos and an asham are two categories of karbonos that could never come binidava. There's no such thing as an idava. I can't wake up one day and say, I want to offer on a voluntary basis a carbon chatos or a carbon asham. These are karbonos chov. So the guy violated one of his averis, one of his 7 averis, and he wants to bring a korban chatos. And you and I would have said, well, just like a Jew who violated his Havera, Bishogeg, brings a korban chatos under those, right, whatever the conditions are, so too, Lahavdil, a guy could offer a korban chatos because, let's say, he worshipped Avodah Zarah. Now, the Taklin Chadatin that we always quote gives another example of a guy who wants to offer a korban chatos, or actually korban asham in this case. It's something called asham gzelos, which means that a person stole, and then when the nigzal came to be tovea him, he denied it and he took a shvuah. And later on, we find out that the shvuah was a shvuah sheker, and he was chai for gneva, for gzela, and he has to bring a korban asham. So the guy went through the same thing. He stole something, he denied it when they sued him in a bezdin, and he took a shvuah. Now he admits that he perjured himself and he wants to bring a korban asham. So we don't accept them. Why? Because in the parsha of Chatos, the Torah says Bnei Yisrael. That's the introduction to the parsha of Chatos, and that is a miyah to exclude Nachrim, and there's a hekesh between a korban asham and a korban Chatos, and therefore the goyim are excluded from these korbanos. However, makabel mehem nidarim unidavos. That klal, and the Mishnah formulates a general overall rule. Call shenidar v'nidev, right? There's a difference between a neder and a dava, right? A dava is when you say harei zu, and a neder is harei alai. But in any event, these are voluntary korbanos, and the goyim can bring voluntary korbanos makabel biyod, and that refers to olos, possibly even shlomim, which is also a Jew at least can certainly offer a nadav of a shlomim. There are Rishonim say that we don't accept shlomim from a guy. And then we have menachos. And in menachos you can have a minchas nidava. But if you have a korban which you can only bring the korban if you're chayav in the korban, it doesn't lend itself to an option, then ein mekabel miyadim, we don't accept it. Even though they want to bring that korban, they want to volunteer. But no. This korban can only come as a chov. And even though you would have said that they're in a situation which is exactly identical to a situation where a Jew would be chai of the korban. So, for example, if a Jew violates avodah zarah chashon b'shogeg, he brings a korban chatos. So a guy comes along, he says, "Well, for whatever reason, unbeknown to me, I worship an idol. I want to bring a korban chatos. We don't accept it from him. Is ein mekabel biyod. V'chein meforash al yidei Ezra." And now we're talking about the kusim. What happens in Sefer Ezra? Now, the kusim often wanted to show that they were like the Jews. So during the period of Ezra, when they were rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, the Mikdash Sheni, so when the kusim heard that there was a campaign to raise money for the Beis HaMikdash, they turned to the Jewish establishment and they said, we would like to offer our funds and participate in this glorious endeavor. And that's what it says in the pasuk, Nivneh imachem, let us participate and be partners with you in building the Beis HaMikdash. And Klal Yisrael refused to accept that gift. Shenemar, this is a pasuk in Ezra. Lo lachem v'lanu livnos bayis Elokeinu. Okay, so I'm not sure about the word velanu. We have to look up in the Mefarshim there. And It says also in Nehemiah, it says V'lachem ein chelek utstaka v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim. So even though the Kusim came forward and they offered v'nivne imachem, we refuse to allow them to participate in these, in the money, in raising the funds for these karbanos. Okay. So now, Rabbosai, I want to give an introduction to the next part of the Mishnah. This is a very long Mishnah, but we're now on Daf Daled Amud Aleph. Now, there's something called a kalbon. A kalbon, I can only tell you, is a matbea ktana. Not sure exactly what it's worth, but it's pennies. It's like it's a lightweight kind of matbea. Now, why does someone who brings a machzah shekel have to add this extra fee, which is called a kalbon? Rashi in Masechet Bechoros offers two explanations for this obligation to bring a kalbon. He says that, according to one explanation, the purpose of the kalbon is to guarantee that the shear of money that's being contributed is a machzas shekel. Why? Because the shekel devaluated over the course of time. So to make up for that devaluation, from the time of the Torah till today, we added this kalbon. But Yesh Omrim, Rashi quotes a second explanation, and that is a chiluf. Now, what happens with chiluf is that if you don't have exact change, so let's say, for example, you want to take a selah and break it down into two machzas shekel. Well, let's say two people want to be mekayim the mitzvah machzas shekel, they want to bring a selah, which is fine, except they want to get change. So they go to a money changer. So the money changer obviously is going to charge a fee. I mean, that's how he survives. Right? That's how he makes his living. So yesh omrim kevan shematbeos matzah shekel he matbeos ktanos v'dakos is machlifin also eitzel shulchani lematbeos gedolos. So this kalbon is a payment to make up for the, it's the word I need, the in English, the service charge, the
fee.
The fee. Okay, we'll call it a fee. So the money changer charges you a fee, and you want to circumvent that fee by coming to the Beis HaMikdash and offering a selah on behalf of two people, because a selah is enough to cover both of us, because it's a machzah shekel times two. But in effect, we are now cutting out the money changer and saving us that. Okay. I want to use a different word than fee. I want to call it a commission. Okay, it doesn't matter. Whatever word you like. It's the same idea. So you want to cut out the commission of the money changer. And Chazal made a takana that you should pay the kalbon, which is the equivalent, more or less, of what the fee or the commission that you would have had to pay the money changer. Again, we have two approaches of Rashi to understand the kalbon. Both are offered by Rashi in Masechet Bechoros. One opinion is that there is a certain element of deflation in the value of the Masechet Shekel to make up and guarantee the difference between the Masechet Shekel today and the Masechet Shekel at the time of the Torah. We add this extra fee called the kalbon. And the other approach is that this is kalbon is a lashon chiluf. Chiluf means to change, and if you want to save yourself that commission, so we charge you a kalbon. Okay. Elu chayovim bekalbon. Now we'll just end with this part of the mission. Again, we're not going to go through. There are many different permutations of kalbon. Many. We're going to just start with the simple one. Elu chayovim bekalbon, leviim v'Yisraelim v'gerim v'avodim mishuchrar. In other words, if you have a chiyuv of machtas hashekel, you're not offering something voluntarily, then we add an extra fee, which is called the kalbon. Avalo, but if you are offering a voluntary payment, for example, kohanim, noshim, v'avodim, uktanim, then we're not going to charge you that extra fee of a kalbon, because you're, out of the goodness of your heart, you're offering a payment of a machzah shekel that is not obligatory. That's purely gratis. It's a voluntary gift. So we're not going to bill you with a kalbon. Now, kohanim is listed on this voluntary list, probably because we don't have a mashkin in Esak, right? And in the case of kohanim, we're not going to go after them if they don't offer the machzah shekel. So they're chiyuv. So if they offer the machzah shekel, we don't have to go running after them, and we're going to give them a chupar, as the Israelis call it. That's an Arabic word, right? We'll let you off the hook for the kalbon. Sort of like it's a way of giving you a tip and appreciating the fact that you voluntarily brought the machzah shekel. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop, and tomorrow, Belina, we'll start with the kalbon, and we'll really try to sink our teeth into this whole concept of a kalbon. I wish everyone a great day. Thank you.